The call came in just after dawn. A fisherman had been moving slowly along the calm waters of Galveston Bay, Texas. The morning air was still. The tide was low. At first, he thought the object floating near the shoreline was trash. Then he saw the plastic, black garbage bags, several of them. When police arrived, the scene quickly changed from a routine call to something far more disturbing. The bags had been weighted down with rocks. Inside them were human remains. But something was wrong. The body had been carefully dismembered. The head was missing. So were the hands. Investigators immediately understood what that meant. Whoever had done this had tried to erase a person's identity. But the trail they were about to follow would lead them somewhere few detectives ever expected to go, into the world of wealth, privilege, and one of the most unusual suspects in modern criminal history, a man named Robert Durst. To understand the case investigators had to go back decades. Robert Durst was not an ordinary suspect. He was born into one of the most powerful real estate families in New York. The Durst organization owned some of the most valuable properties in Manhattan. Their buildings shaped the skyline of the city. Money was never a problem. But Robert Durst had always been different from the rest of his family. Quiet, withdrawn, sometimes unpredictable. Friends described him as socially awkward. Family members later suggested he struggled with emotional instability. But nothing in his early life hinted at the strange path his future would take. In the early 1970s, Durst met a young woman named Kathleen McCormack. Kathleen was ambitious, outgoing, studying to become a doctor. The two married in 1973. At first, their life together seemed normal. They lived in New York City. They attended social events. From the outside, it appeared to be a typical marriage between a wealthy businessman and a young professional. But privately, things were deteriorating. Friends later described their relationship as volatile. Arguments were frequent. Some of Kathleen's friends later claimed she had confided that Robert could be controlling, even frightening during arguments. Still, nothing suggested the mystery that was about to unfold. Then came the night of January 31, 1982. That evening, Kathleen attended a small gathering with friends. Several people would later recall she seemed tense, but she also seemed determined.
One friend later told investigators Kathleen had been considering leaving Robert. Sometime later that night, she returned to the home she shared with him in South Salem, New York. It would be the last time anyone ever saw her. The next morning, Kathleen was gone. At first, the situation appeared confusing. Robert Durst told police he had dropped Kathleen off at a train station so she could return to Manhattan. But investigators quickly noticed something strange. No one at the station remembered seeing her, and Kathleen never showed up at medical school. Her belongings remained untouched. Her car was still at the house. Her bank accounts went silent. She had simply vanished. Police opened a missing persons investigation, but the case immediately faced obstacles. Robert Durst was cooperative but guarded. His story never changed. He insisted Kathleen had taken the train, and without a body, detectives had little evidence to challenge him. Months passed, then years. Eventually, the case grew cold. Kathleen McCormack was never found, and officially, Robert Durst was never charged. For many investigators, the case remained one of those quiet mysteries that never quite made sense. But the story was far from over, because nearly 20 years later, another strange death would pull Robert Durst back into the spotlight, this time in California. In the year 2000, a woman named Susan Berman was found dead in her Beverly Hills home. She had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. Police quickly noticed something unusual. Before officers even arrived, someone had anonymously mailed a letter to authorities. The letter simply read, "Cadaver." Inside was Susan Berman's address. The handwriting was blocky, deliberate, as if someone had tried to disguise their natural writing style. Investigators eventually learned something else. Susan Berman had been close friends with Robert Durst, very close. In fact, years earlier, she had reportedly acted as Durst's unofficial spokesperson when reporters began asking questions about Kathleen's disappearance. But now, Susan Berman was dead, and again, Robert Durst was somehow connected to the center of the story. Still, detectives struggled to prove anything. No witnesses, no clear motive, and again, the trail seemed to fade. but the pattern was beginning to worry investigators. 2 women connected to Robert Durst, 2 unexplained tragedies, and still no answers. Then, in 2001, the case took an even stranger turn. Robert Durst disappeared. For weeks, no one knew where he had gone, until police in Texas made a bizarre discovery. A quiet man living in Galveston, under a false identity, calling himself Dorothy Sinner. The name belonged to a mute woman who had once lived in the building. The man paying rent under that name was Robert Durst. But that wasn't the strangest part, because only weeks later, the dismembered body discovered in Galveston Bay was finally identified. The victim was Morris Black, Durst's elderly neighbor. Police quickly connected the 2 men. Durst admitted they had argued.
He admitted Morris Black had been shot, but Durst claimed something unusual. He said it had been self-defense. According to Durst, Black had threatened him with a gun during a confrontation inside the apartment. Durst claimed the weapon fired accidentally during the struggle. Then came the part that shocked investigators. Durst calmly admitted he had dismembered the body. He said he panicked. He said he disposed of the remains in the bay. It was an explanation that sounded almost unbelievable. But when the case finally went to trial, Durst's defense team argued that he had acted out of fear. And in one of the most surprising outcomes in modern criminal trials, Robert Durst was acquitted of murder. For many observers, the verdict felt impossible to understand. A man who admitted to dismembering a body, yet walked free. But behind the scenes, investigators were still watching, still asking questions, because the deeper they looked into Robert Durst's past, the more troubling the pattern became. A missing wife, a murdered friend, a dismembered neighbor. 3 cases, 3 mysteries, and 1 man standing quietly at the center of them all. But what investigators did not know yet was that years later, a documentary camera would capture something no detective had ever heard before. A moment, a whisper, words spoken when Robert Durst believed he was completely alone. Words that would change the entire investigation and reopen every secret he had tried to bury. But that revelation would not come until much later. For years, Robert Durst remained an enigma, a man surrounded by death, yet repeatedly walking free. After the trial in Texas, he returned to a life that looked strangely ordinary. The Durst family fortune remained enormous. His name still carried influence. But detectives across the country had not forgotten him. The disappearance of Kathleen McCormack, the murder of Susan Berman, and the strange killing of Morris Black. 3 separate cases, 3 decades of unanswered questions. Investigators suspected the truth was still buried somewhere inside Robert Durst's past. They just didn't know how to prove it. Then, in 2010, something unexpected happened. A group of documentary filmmakers began examining Durst's story. They wanted to understand the strange patterns surrounding his life: the missing wife, the murdered friend, the dismembered neighbor. The project would eventually become a documentary series, and surprisingly, Robert Durst agreed to participate. For the filmmakers, it was a rare opportunity. Durst had avoided serious media interviews for decades, but this time he sat down in front of the camera. He appeared calm, polite, sometimes even oddly cooperative. He spoke about his childhood, about the pressures of growing up in a powerful family, about the night Kathleen disappeared. But something about the interviews felt unsettling. Durst's tone rarely changed, even when discussing events that had destroyed lives. The filmmakers noticed small details, moments where Durst seemed strangely detached, moments where he smiled at inappropriate times. But the real turning point came during the production of the series. One day, the filmmakers showed Durst something they had recently discovered: a letter. Years earlier, police had received the anonymous cadaver letter after Susan Berman's murder. The handwriting on the envelope had always been a mystery, but the filmmakers had uncovered another piece of evidence: a personal letter written by Robert Durst years before. When placed side by side, the 2 letters looked nearly identical. The same blocky handwriting, the same spelling mistakes, even the same unusual formatting. For the first time, Durst appeared visibly uncomfortable during the interview. He stared at the letters in silence. Then he offered a vague explanation. He suggested many people could write that way. The moment passed, but something else happened that day, something no one noticed at the time. After the interview ended, Robert Durst walked into the bathroom. He was still wearing the microphone used during filming. Durst didn't realize the microphone was still recording. Inside the quiet bathroom,
He began speaking softly to himself. What he said next would later shock investigators across the country. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone captured every word. Durst murmured to himself, almost as if thinking out loud, "What the hell did I do?" Then a pause, more whispering, "Caught." Another pause, and then a sentence investigators would replay again and again. "There it is, you're caught." He took a breath, and then said quietly, "Killed them all, of course." The moment lasted only seconds, but when the filmmakers discovered the recording later, they realized they had captured something extraordinary, possibly the closest thing to a confession anyone had ever heard from Robert Durst. The recording quickly drew the attention of law enforcement. For detectives who had spent decades chasing Durst, the audio felt like the missing piece they had been waiting for. Investigators reopened the case involving Susan Berman. This time, they moved quickly. In March 2015, Robert Durst was arrested in New Orleans. The charge was murder, specifically the killing of Susan Berman. Authorities believed Berman had been silenced. She knew too much about Kathleen McCormack's disappearance, and investigators suspected she may have been preparing to speak to police. For the first time in decades, Robert Durst faced a murder charge connected to the long chain of mysteries surrounding his life. The trial would become one of the most unusual cases in modern criminal history.
Durst appeared frail. His voice was soft, but the evidence prosecutors presented painted a disturbing picture. The cadaver letter, the handwriting match, the history of suspicious deaths, and most powerful of all, the bathroom recording, Durst's own whispered words. The defense team fought back. They argued the recording had been taken out of context. They questioned the reliability of the evidence, and they reminded the jury that Durst had previously been acquitted in Texas. But prosecutors believed the pattern was now impossible to ignore. 3 lives, 3 tragedies, and a man who seemed to appear at the center of every one. The trial lasted months. Witnesses testified. Old evidence was re-examined. Decades of secrets slowly surfaced in the courtroom. Finally, in September 2021, the jury reached a verdict. Robert Durst was found guilty of the murder of Susan Berman. For the first time in his life, the billionaire heir was convicted of murder. The sentence was life in prison. For investigators who had chased the case for decades, it felt like long-delayed justice. But even with the conviction, the deeper mystery remained unsolved, because the most important question had never truly been answered. What really happened to Kathleen McCormack in 1982? Her body had never been found. Her disappearance had never been fully explained. And now, Robert Durst was an elderly man. His health was declining. But detectives still hoped one day the truth would emerge. Then, only months after the verdict, something unexpected happened. Robert Durst's condition suddenly worsened. Prison officials reported severe medical complications. Investigators realized something troubling. If Durst died, the secrets surrounding Kathleen's disappearance might die with him. Detectives considered one final possibility, a last attempt to ask the question that had haunted the case for nearly 40 years. What happened to Kathleen? Because if Robert Durst decided to speak, he might finally reveal the truth behind the first mystery, the one that started everything. And what he was about to say next
would raise even more disturbing questions. By late 2021, Robert Durst was no longer the quiet billionaire who had spent decades moving through investigations without consequence. He was now a convicted murderer, old, frail, and sitting in a prison hospital in California. For many investigators, the conviction for the murder of Susan Berman had brought a sense of closure. It was the first time in nearly 40 years that Robert Durst had been held legally responsible for one of the deaths surrounding him. But for detectives who had spent their careers studying the case, the conviction answered only one question. The most important mystery still remained. What happened to Kathleen McCormack Durst? The disappearance of Durst's first wife had always been the starting point of the entire story. It was the moment when investigators first began noticing strange patterns in Durst's life, patterns that, over time, would expand into something far more disturbing. For decades, Kathleen's disappearance had remained a missing person case without a body. Without physical evidence, prosecutors had been unable to bring charges. Yet investigators never stopped examining the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Because the deeper they looked into Robert Durst's world, the more unusual connections began to appear.
Durst was not simply a wealthy man living a quiet life. He belonged to one of the most powerful real estate dynasties in New York. The Durst organization, founded by his father, had built some of Manhattan's most prominent skyscrapers. Their properties were tied to major financial networks, investment firms, and political relationships that stretched across decades. In many ways, Robert Durst grew up inside an environment where influence and power were part of daily life. For investigators, this created a complicated challenge. Cases involving individuals with significant financial resources often unfold very differently from ordinary criminal investigations. Legal teams are larger, private investigators are hired, public narratives are shaped carefully through attorneys and media statements. Small details that might normally surface quickly can become buried under layers of legal protection. In the early years after Kathleen disappeared, several investigators later admitted that the case had faced unusual resistance. Witnesses were reluctant. Records were difficult to obtain. Private lawyers frequently intervened. None of this proved a criminal conspiracy, but it illustrated something detectives often encounter when investigating powerful individuals. Influence changes the environment of an investigation. It does not necessarily prevent justice, but it can slow it, complicate it, and sometimes redirect it entirely. At the same time, Robert Durst himself presented another unique challenge. Psychologists who later analyzed his interviews and courtroom behavior noticed a pattern of psychological detachment. Durst often spoke about disturbing events with remarkable calm.
Even when describing the dismemberment of his neighbor, Morris Black, he appeared almost analytical. Not emotional, not defensive, just factual. This kind of emotional separation is sometimes observed in individuals who display traits associated with psychopathy or extreme narcissistic personality structures. Such individuals can compartmentalize actions in ways that allow them to function socially while concealing behaviors that would normally provoke guilt or fear. In many investigations, detectives rely on emotional pressure to expose inconsistencies in a suspect's story. But suspects who lack those emotional triggers can be extraordinarily difficult to interrogate. They remain calm, they calculate their responses, and they wait. Robert Durst seemed to embody this type of psychological control. For decades, investigators confronted him with questions about Kathleen's disappearance, yet he never directly confessed. Even in the now famous bathroom recording captured during the filming of the documentary series, Durst's whispered statement remained ambiguous enough for legal debate. Killed them all, of course. 4 words. Powerful, but not enough to convict him in the case of Kathleen's disappearance. The law demands something stronger. Proof.
Physical evidence. Witness testimony that can survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. Without those elements, prosecutors cannot proceed. And in cases where a body is never recovered, those elements can be nearly impossible to establish. Meanwhile, the larger structure surrounding Durst's life continued to raise questions about how wealth and influence interact with the justice system. The Durst family empire remained active in New York real estate. Law firms associated with the family were among the most experienced in the country. And for years, Robert Durst had access to legal defenses few suspects could afford. None of this meant the system was corrupt, but it demonstrated something important about complex investigations. Justice is rarely a simple process. It is shaped by resources, jurisdictional boundaries, investigative limitations, and time. Cases involving multiple states, decades-old evidence, and powerful individuals can become some of the most difficult investigations law enforcement ever faces. The Durst case illustrated how these forces intersect. A missing woman in New York, a murder in California, a dismembered body in Texas. 3 states, 3 investigations, 3 separate legal systems working independently. Only years later did the full pattern begin to emerge. By then, decades had passed.
Witness memories had faded. Evidence had disappeared. Yet persistence eventually brought one conviction. Robert Durst was found guilty of the murder of Susan Berman in 2021. For investigators, it represented partial justice, but the first mystery remained unsolved. Then, in January 2022, Robert Durst died in prison. With his death, the possibility of a full confession disappeared. The man who had spent 40 years surrounded by unanswered questions was gone, and the truth about Kathleen McCormack may have vanished with him. Today, the case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement agencies, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of what the investigation revealed about power, psychology, and the complexity of modern criminal justice. The story of Robert Durst demonstrates how criminal behavior can hide behind wealth and influence, how psychological detachment can frustrate investigators, and how the legal system, bound by evidence and procedure, must navigate those realities carefully. In the end, the Durst case was not simply about a single man. It was about the intersection of privilege, human psychology, and the limits of investigative power. And it serves as a reminder of a difficult truth in criminal investigations. Sometimes justice arrives slowly. Sometimes it arrives only partially. And sometimes, even after decades of investigation, the final secret remains buried where it began, inside the mind of the person who carried it.